Tonight, the federal government issues a new Canadian passport for a convicted human smuggler.
Probably one of the worst failures I've seen.
He was ordered to surrender his passport, but it is not clear Ottawa got the message.
He obtained it through Service Canada.
A CBC News investigation. Donald Trump picks Dr. Oz to run Medicare.
I've got simple, revolutionary new ways to change your health forever.
As pressure mounts over his nominee for Attorney General accused of sexual misconduct. And former Canadian Justice Minister Irwin Cotler speaks out about the Iranian plot to assassinate him.
I still have the armored cars outside of my house. I still have constant 24/7 protection.
The current threat against him and why he says it is just the tip of the iceberg.
From CBC News, this is The National with Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault.
Thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with the CBC News investigation into how a known human smuggler got a new Canadian passport after being ordered to surrender it to ensure he didn't flee the country. That passport was found during a search of the man's home. At the time, he was waiting to be sentenced in another smuggling case, allowed to go home, but required to wear electronic monitoring. Still, he was able to apply for and received a new passport. Investigative reporter Jorge Barrera now on what went wrong and the concerns about Canada's screening process.
Terror on the water. 9 people from 2 families, including an infant and a toddler, drowned last March in the cold, rough waters of the St. Lawrence River, along with the man piloting their boat on a human smuggling run into the U.S.
The motivation in this is pure greed.
CBC News has learned the man behind the alleged smuggling network, Thesson Garrison Rasaya, was later found with a Canadian passport that never should have been issued. Matthew Amer first arrested Rasaya in this Cornwall, Ontario motel parking lot 3 years ago. The retired OPP officer was also part of a border task force that raided the human smuggler's Montreal home after the river deaths.
During that search warrant that he had obtained a new passport just a few weeks previously.
He obtained it through Service Canada.
Rasaya was barred from having a passport by a court order. He was forced to surrender it after he was charged for another human smuggling case in 2021. It was part of strict release conditions to ensure he could not flee the country. It began with a tip from U.S. Border Patrol, and it ended here. Police watched as Rasaya pulled in to pick up the Sri Lankan national who had just been smuggled into Canada.
So they were boxed in and guns were drawn until we established that everything was safe, took everybody into custody.
I have a hope I will get some kind of refugee application process is easy again in this country.
Amer interviewed the Sri Lankan man with the help of a Tamil interpreter on speakerphone, who told him Rasaya charged him 7,000 Canadian dollars to get smuggled into Canada.
My role here is to investigate the criminality involving people smuggling him across the border as a victim.
I don't know the process in this country.
Now the federal government is facing questions over Canada's passport integrity.
Probably one of the worst failures I've seen in 9 years now.
The conservative immigration critic says he wants an investigation into how Rasaya was issued a new passport while under court order barring him from having one.
And how bad is our national security infrastructure when we can't catch the most basic things in our system.
Experts have told us that the passport system is a weak link. Screening is superficial and done in a silo. It depends on police services calling up passport officials to say, hey, flag this individual. They're being forced to surrender their passport. Now, did that fail to happen in this case? The RCMP isn't saying.
And Jorge, I gather the Minister of Immigration is now facing questions over how this was all handled.
He did face questions during question period today, and also Conservative and Bloc members have written to the Liberal chair of the Parliamentary Immigration and Citizenship Committee requesting an urgent hearing on this particular case and also the broader issue of cross-border human smuggling. Adrian?
All right, Jorge Barrera in Ottawa for us tonight. Thanks, Jorge. The company once co-owned by Employment Minister Randy Boissonnault is under police investigation tonight. As Kate McKenna shows us, that is on top of the growing number of voices calling for him to resign over conflicting claims about his family's Indigenous heritage.
Across the country, Employment Minister Randy Boissonnault is facing calls for accountability over his ties to a business that falsely claimed to be Indigenous owned.
Clearly find out who you are before you claim who you are, because it could cause such great harm to so many.
I think ignorance is not an excuse and he should resign.
In the House of Commons, opposition parties say he's got to go.
Why on earth has the Prime Minister not fired this man?
Right.
If he does not resign, it is incumbent upon the Prime Minister to kick someone like that out.
He is a fraud, and I don't withdraw.
The tone got so heated, 3 Conservatives were tossed from the chamber.
I have to name you for disregarding the authority of the chair.
Boissonnault is under fire over allegations of illegal business practices and claims of Indigenous heritage. His former company bid on federal contracts claiming to be Indigenous owned, but it wasn't. Boissonnault denies all wrongdoing and says those bids were his business partner's fault. The Indigenous Services Minister stopped short of issuing a defense.
I can't speak to Mr. Boissonnault's indigeneity. That's for him to clarify. Any fraudulent claims to indigeneity deeply hurts Indigenous people.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau offered only lukewarm support when asked about the allegations.
Minister Boissonnault has addressed these and will continue to answer directly for those. In the meantime, I'm happy that he is continuing to lead on issues around jobs and employment and represent Alberta in our government.
Boissonnault is one of only 2 Alberta MPs in the Liberal caucus. Shuffling him out of cabinet could have regional repercussions. But now Edmonton police confirm they're investigating Boissonnault's former company on a separate allegation of fraud. More pressure for the Prime Minister and more fuel for the opposition. Kate McKenna, CBC News, Ottawa.
Human rights advocate Irwin Cotler is sharing new details about being the target of an assassination plot. Olivia Stefanovich now with what he's been forced to endure and the effort to keep him safe.
In the face of an ongoing threat against his life, human rights advocate Irwin Cotler says Iran won't stop him.
We hold the regime accountable and send the message that we will not be intimidated, that we will not be silenced.
In an interview with The National, the former Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada told Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault he started facing imminent and lethal danger more than a year ago. The source unknown until after he started receiving around-the-clock RCMP protection.
That wasn't a surprise to me because Iran had been escalating its own transnational not only repression, but assassination.
As first reported in the Globe and Mail, Cotler learned he became the target of a specific assassination plot by agents of Iran 3 weeks ago, a plan to unfold within 48 hours, foiled by police. Cotler says there were 2 suspects, the public safety minister refraining from sharing details.
It's not a Netflix series where we sort of tell people about some person that arrived at an airport on this date and he's staying at this hotel.
Cotler says he believes the regime in Tehran is trying to end his advocacy for Iranian political prisoners and the global listing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist entity.
You're really dealing with a collective danger to our human security. And regrettably, Iran has been able to carry this out amidst a culture of impunity.
Even though Cotler's life appears to no longer be in imminent danger, he remains under 24/7 RCMP protection, with armored vehicles still stationed outside his house. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News, Ottawa.
So as you saw in Olivia's piece, I spoke with Cotler today about the threats he's facing, how he first found out about them, and how this has changed his life. More from that interview in about 20 minutes. Well, the families of Paul Bernardo's victims are angry tonight after learning they won't be allowed to read victim impact statements in person at a parole hearing next week.
These families have suffered enough, and they are entitled to the benefit and the protection of the law.
In a letter to the parole board, the lawyer for the families of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey calls the decision unacceptable and insulting. He says the board is citing safety and security, but that it won't say whose safety is apparently at risk. Bernardo, who was designated a dangerous offender, was quietly transferred to a medium security prison last year, sparking outrage from the families. Well, illegal handgun modifiers are turning up at Ontario crime scenes. The small device can turn a handgun into a machine gun. And as Thomas Daig tells us, the modifiers were used in a frightening shootout in downtown Toronto.
Handguns are lethal, to be sure. But those same weapons are being illegally modified in Ontario to fire like this.
These items do alter that functionality where these guns can fire 900, 1,200 rounds a minute.
Not long after partygoers were seen on video last week waving guns in the air, Toronto police swooped in on a downtown shootout, seizing handguns outfitted with those tiny devices on the back nicknamed Glock switches that transform a semi-automatic firearm into a machine gun.
We do see a high rate of innocent civilians getting hurt because the person firing this weapon has no control.
In that Toronto shooting, investigators say suspects fired nearly 100 rounds in a crowded neighborhood, while nearby Peel police recently showed off a big weapons seizure, including 53 Glock switches.
The more amount of rounds being discharged is also increased per incident.
In Alabama just last week, listen to the hail of bullets.
Oh my gosh!
Leading to the arrest of a man with one of those machine gun conversion devices. On this side of the border, too, they appear all too easy to buy. CBC News found this website offering to sell and ship Glock switches to Canada, while online video shows how to install the device in less than 1 minute.
There's no easy solution to this. There's an increasingly evolving and unpredictable criminal landscape in Canada now for which there's no real precedent.
He says federal firearm legislation has failed to curb the use of illegal weapons on the street. Now Glock switches the size of a quarter could be making this city's growing gun problem even worse. Thomas Daig, CBC News, Toronto.
Canada's inflation rate jumped in October by a bit more than analysts had expected. StatsCan pegs the increase at 2% compared to a year earlier. The prediction was 1.9. That difference could affect the Bank of Canada's next interest rate announcement. Instead of shaving off another 0.5 percentage point, the bank may prefer a more cautious cut of 0.25 percentage point. Well, Donald Trump has tapped former TV host Dr. Oz to run Medicare in the U.S. It's just the latest unconventional pick. But Paul Hunter shows us there's a greater controversy around his nominee for Attorney General.
Today, in a fast-growing list at once applauded and slammed by those for and against Donald Trump,
I've got simple, revolutionary new ways to change your health forever.
Mehmet Oz, known as Dr. Oz from his days as a TV personality and physician, is now Trump's pick to run the U.S. Medicare and Medicaid agencies. He joins multi-billionaire Elon Musk, Fox News host Pete Hegseth, and Robert Kennedy Jr. as among Trump's cabinet nominees and appointments. But arguably the most contentious pick is former Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, now in ever deeper controversy. The issue? Whether unreleased findings of a House Ethics Committee investigation into sexual misconduct allegations against Gaetz should be shown to lawmakers who will decide whether he should be Attorney General.
Well, my clients want it to be released because they want the truth to be known.
Now, a lawyer for two women who testified before the House committee has gone public with what they said under oath.
The testimony before the House was yes, that Representative Gaetz paid my client, both of my clients, for sexual favors throughout the summer of 2017 all the way to the beginning of 2019.
Gaetz was also investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice for such misconduct, but never charged. Still, pressure mounts for the House committee's report to be factored in on Gaetz's nomination process.
I think that if they want a speedy consideration of this nomination, we've got to have as much transparency as we can have.
All of this as word a hacker has somehow accessed the report on Gaetz online, adding to the expectation that one way or another more details will emerge. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is said to be pushing hard for Gaetz no matter what. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
There are new warnings tonight from Russia that the war in Ukraine is entering a new dangerous phase with long-range American missiles now in play. Chris Brown on the concerning rhetoric 1,000 days into the war.
Just hours after Ukraine finally got the green light to fire longer-range U.S. ATACMS missiles at targets in Russia, it appears they did, hitting a munitions depot in Bryansk. Unusually, confirmation came from Russia's government first, claiming it shot down 5 of the 6 missiles, while Ukraine's president kept things vague. Ukraine has long-range capabilities, said Vladimir Zelensky, and we will use them all. Russia has been pounding Ukrainian cities like Sumy unrelentingly, but Vladimir Putin's regime said using U.S. missiles on Russia was a red line the West should not cross.
We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
Russia announced it's changing its nuclear weapons policy, essentially lowering the threshold for their use. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev spelled it out that NATO missiles fired against our country could trigger World War III.
When nuclear weapons...
This war studies expert says Russia can use sabotage and other tactics before its nuclear arsenal.
I don't think that it would be in Russia's interest to go all out, because there are so many other options that Russia can exploit and can actually do more damage, because once the Pandora box is open, you cannot close it.
This day of escalation comes as Ukraine marks 1,000 days since Russia's invasion. I want the end of the war to come as soon as possible, she said. Negotiations instigated by incoming President Trump are what both sides appear to be positioning for. Chris Brown, CBC News, London.
The pressure is on at the COP29 climate conference with just days to go to get a deal done.
We now need to translate political will into practical work.
Why some are concerned about what the deal won't include. Next. Plus, Canada's deteriorating mental health.
We're spending a smaller percentage on mental health than we used to 10 years ago.
A new report says millions aren't getting the care they need. And later, the tennis world bids farewell to a legend. Rafael Nadal's full circle moment. We're back in 2 minutes. One of 2 main runways at Vancouver International Airport is shut down tonight and will stay that way for at least 48 hours. An Amazon Prime cargo plane overran its landing this morning. No one was injured, but the airport says it's a large plane that will take days to dislodge from the mud. At the UN climate conference in Azerbaijan, advocates are making their voices heard before a final deal is done. And many say a shift away from fossil fuels is a must-have. International climate correspondent Susan Ormiston is there.
Tax billionaires, polluters, and fix the climate, a protest in Brazil for G20 leaders meeting there, who didn't copy that in their final communique, but did send a message to the United Nations Climate Conference in Azerbaijan. In short, get the climate finance deal done this week.
We now need to translate political will into practical work.
A boost for flagging talks, maybe. But an obvious omission, say analysts, was no mention of fossil fuels. None.
As the world's biggest economies and biggest emitters, their statement of walking away from fossil fuel would have made a huge wind in the sail for these negotiations here.
Especially after last year's COP in Dubai.
It is so decided.
Where they agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. Some parties want that intention underscored here. So far, it's not.
There is a lack of recognition that transitioning away from fossil fuels is part of the solution. And this is worrying.
With the COP talks reaching a critical stage.
The talks are very slow. And the reason it's low is that no country has made a real offer on the table.
Watching and waiting, those who are advocating for help. Edith Nasika-Santian knows too well what drought looks like.
In between the year 2020, 2023, we lost around 4.5 million livestock within the Maasai communities. And that is a source of livelihoods for the Maasai community. And so when these livestock are actually gone, what happens? The entire community becomes so devastated. The women in the indigenous communities are the ones that take responsibility.
This is Edith's second UN climate conference, and this time she wants to return home with a promise of financial support to help especially young women adapt to the future. But countries are still at loggerheads over who and how to pay up. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Baku.
The CBC is bidding a fond farewell to the outstanding investigative journalist Bob McKeown. So Bob is best known for his work on The Fifth Estate, now in its 50th season, but Bob began as a freelance sports commentator while also playing for the Ottawa Rough Riders. Good practice, it turned out, for a story on animal cruelty and a strange encounter with the TV host he told me about when we sat down to talk.
But Marlon Perkins said, I don't know why you would ask me that question. And I said, well, we asked the same thing of Roy Disney. He said, no, I don't want to talk about that. And I said, well,
can I give you an example of what they've said to us?
No, I would like not to have this on the air, and I'd like to have you stop your camera right now, please.
What do you do?
And then he punched me. Now, it's true, he was 81, but...
And you were a professional football player,
Formerly, but a gentle one.
Mm-hmm.
And he punched me in the... I think he was aiming for my nose, but he sort of hit a glancing blow on my chin.
You can catch my full interview with Bob McKeown next week on The National. Well, a new report says the mental health of Canadians is 3 times worse than it was before the COVID-19 pandemic.
What this data does is it really tells a story about the lack of access.
Why we're lagging behind other countries. Plus, an outspoken critic of Iran, he's now been the target of an assassination attempt.
So I still have constant 24/7 protection.
My interview with former Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. And Ukraine has fired US-made long-range missiles into Russia.
Nobody appears to be wasting any time in getting this permission from the Biden administration into the battlefield.
How this could change the war. The National breaks down the stories shaping our world. Next. Those are the Toronto Argonauts back home and partying hard with fans after their Grey Cup victory. The team blew out the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Sunday final, giving the Argos their second championship in 3 years and their league-leading 19th Grey Cup overall. Well, a new first-of-its-kind report on mental health in Canada is painting a bleak picture tonight. It shows millions of Canadians are not getting the help they need. Mike Crawley on its findings and what it says needs to change.
Many Canadians struggle with their mental health, and now a new report card shows when they go looking for help, they often can't get it.
It points out some of the cracks and failings in the system.
Lena Lowe leads the team behind the report.
What this data does is it really tells a story about the lack of access.
It shows that nearly 8% of Canadians aged 12 and up are not getting the mental health care they need. That adds up to 2.5 million people. Leanne Minicillo knows what that's like.
There's like a wall between doctors and community mental health.
She was diagnosed with depression and anxiety and spent months trying to find publicly funded psychotherapy.
If you decide you need help and that door is closed, you may never go back, right? If I didn't receive that help, I would be 6 feet under right now.
While Medicare covers the costs of psychiatrists, that's not the case for other mental health services, such as counseling. The report shows provinces spend on average a little more than 6% of their healthcare budgets on mental health, addictions, and substance use, far less than what's spent in such countries as France and Germany.
We're spending a smaller percentage on mental health than we used to 10 years ago. So yeah, we've gone backwards.
One step forward, the report sees the launch of a national suicide crisis helpline.
Hello, 988.
It's averaging nearly 1,000 calls and texts a day.
Our responders are trained to provide connections to a variety of different additional mental health supports to help after the call.
To make sure those supports are available across Canada, the report says the federal government should attach more strings to its healthcare funding and force the provinces to spend more on mental health. Mike Crawley, CBC News, Toronto.
If you are looking for mental health resources near you, you can call or text 211 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, now it's time to dig deeper into the stories shaping our world. Now that the White House says Ukraine can fire long-range U.S. missiles deep inside Russia, we'll break down the policy shift and what it could mean for the war.
The Ukrainians will be able to complicate the planning and execution for the Russians. It will not be able to stop them.
But first, Canada's former Justice Minister, Irwin Cotler, the target of an alleged Iranian assassination plot foiled by police. Earlier this evening, he made some time to speak with us about the threat, first reported by the Globe and Mail, how he learned of it, and what's next for him. Mr. Cotler, thank you for joining us. The news about you this week is pretty shocking. You know, this imminent threat to your life that was foiled. Can you walk us through what happened and what you were told?
Well, actually, the thing began over a year ago when I was traveling back to Montreal from Washington. And as we landed, the RCMP got in touch, told us not to leave the airport. And to sum it up, they then told me that they had credible evidence that I was under imminent and lethal threat. My wife and I were both advised of that at the time. They did not disclose the source of the threat. Some months later, we learned that the threat came from Iran. And then, of course, as the year proceeded, I had the benefit of excellent law enforcement protection until a little over 3 weeks ago, when I was about to attend the 60th anniversary of my McGill law class. I was advised that day that there was not only an imminent and lethal threat, but that threat was to been carried out within the next 48 hours. And so I did not, of course, I was told not to go to the reunion. And then I learned later on, or at least I read in an excellent report of Robert Fife in the Globe and Mail, where it was referenced that the suspects had been apprehended. I don't know about that, but everything else in that report of his was fully reported. And yes, I was under a direct assassination threat within 48 hours. That was as of 3 weeks ago.
Is it your impression that the threat has been diminished? I mean, do you visibly see evidence that the threat to you is lower?
Well, the diminishing is to be found in the fact that my security protection has been somewhat diminished. It's still exemplary. I still have the armored cars outside of my house. I still have constant 24/7 protection. For example, I'm undergoing dialysis now, and yesterday they even, as they always do, accompany me to my treatment, as they do to anything that I do. So the protection is still there. It's still exemplary, but it has been somewhat diminished, if I can use the characterization of it. It's gone from a 5 range to a 4 range.
This is a lot. I'm trying to imagine what kind of toll this takes on your psyche, especially if we go back to when you were first told about this. I'm presuming this is after October 7th, 2023. Was there a connection there to when you first came under threat?
I don't know if there was a connection. Directly, I was told about this at the beginning of November, not long after October 7th. I was then advocating very strongly for putting the IRGC on the terrorist list, which finally happened, though I've been advocating for that for some 15 years now. I was engaged with some of the major political prisoners in Iran. I think if you take all these things together, I think that may have been the kind of tipping point, and that moved where the transnational repression and targeting then escalated into an assassination attempt.
So that phrase that you use, transnational aggression, assassination, I gather you're scheduled to testify in Ottawa at a parliamentary hearing about precisely that. I guess the intimidation of activists in some cases here in Canada by foreign governments. How much of a problem do you think this is in this country?
I think it's a very serious concern. It includes transnational misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, cyber security warfare. It includes the targeting of dissidents and journalists and human rights defenders and the like. It includes as well, what is in effect an assault on the democratic order, on our national security and national sovereignty. When you get into the question of transnational assassination, then you're really dealing with a collective danger to our human security. And regrettably, Iran has been able to carry this out amidst a culture of impunity. We have not sufficiently held the Iranian regime accountable.
As I hear you talk, I think sometimes threats on people's lives have the effect of getting them to stop what they're doing and staying quiet. That's not what's happened to you. Are you not afraid or worried at all about continuing to press the way you do?
Well, I think the Iranian regime, part of the objective of repression and assassination is to silence the targets, to intimidate and the like. And I think if we do that, then they feel they have won. And I'm hopeful that if we show solidarity with the Iranian people, then maybe the Iranian regime itself will begin to take notice, and maybe even there'll be a change in that Iranian regime.
Irwin Cotler, as always, thank you for your time and for your work.
Not at all. Good speaking with you.
You too. Coming up, a major decision in Washington with battlefield implications in Ukraine and Russia.
The Kremlin's defense ministry says 6 long-range U.S. attack missiles were fired by Ukraine at the Bryansk region.
How those long-range missiles could impact the war. That's next. Almost 3 years into its war with Russia, Ukraine gets a go-ahead it's long requested. It can now fire at military targets deeper into Russia using U.S. missiles.
These systems will disrupt Russia's attempts to concentrate its forces as they attack Ukrainian positions in Kursk.
But why did Washington finally lift the ban? Andrew Chang, host of About That, breaks down the factors, the timing, and the possible impact on the course of the war.
Joe Biden has just given Ukraine the green light to cross a Russian red line, authorization to fire U.S.-made long-range missiles directly at Russian targets on Russian soil.
The Kremlin is now accusing U.S. President Joe Biden of adding, quote, oil to the fire.
This is precisely what the U.S. didn't want to do and has held off doing since nearly the start of the war in 2022.
We won't be sending long-range rockets for use beyond the battlefield in Ukraine.
But things are different now. Over the weekend, Russia launched the single deadliest attack on Ukrainian territory in months.
Russian attacks have killed at least 21 people in 2 regions.
Targeted with 120 missiles and 90 drones overnight.
North Korea has also entered the war. Donald Trump will soon enter the White House. And while Ukraine's president has already threatened with this new long-range capability that an attack on Russian soil will come without warning.
The Kremlin says Ukraine has fired US-supplied long-range missiles at a military facility inside Russia in what would be the first attack since Washington authorized the use of its weapons on Russian territory.
The Kremlin's defense ministry says 6 long-range U.S. attack missiles were fired by Ukraine at the Bryansk region.
Nobody appears to be wasting any time in getting this permission from the Biden administration into the battlefield.
Russian lawmakers have responded, this risks starting World War III. So how was this decision made to allow U.S. weapons to be launched into Russian territory, and how does this change the war? Ukraine has desperately argued to use this American-made long-range missile system known as ATACMS. That's an acronym for Army Tactical Missile System. It's manufactured by Lockheed Martin, a series of supersonic ballistic missiles that can fly up to 300 kilometers. That's farther than any Ukrainian missile is capable of. Now, you may or may not know, the US government actually already gave this missile system to Ukraine last year, and it's already used it.
Ukraine's military has shared video they say shows their first use of US long-range missiles against Russian forces.
But these attacks were against Russian targets inside Ukraine because the US wouldn't allow them to fire their rockets into Russian territory. The balancing act for the US since the start has been, how much can we help Ukraine without effectively declaring war on Russia ourselves?
These systems have to use American guidance information. So basically, the Americans are doing co-firing. And the Russians have always said that by so doing, it's the Americans are becoming directly involved in the war, not indirectly, by simply handing off, let's say, like a tank.
In a certain sense, it moves closer towards the US being engaged in a war against Russia rather than supporting a third country in which Russia is in dispute, in conflict, in war with.
The US government did eventually loosen its position back in May, allowing Ukraine to fire ATACMS missiles at Russian targets in Russia that were actively attacking or preparing to attack. So if they were, for example, firing from their side of the border, Ukraine was now allowed to fire back. But today, this wider authorization opens up a brand new array of possibilities. So take a look at this map here of Ukraine, according to the Institute for the Study of War. That's a Washington-based think tank. So the blue right here is Ukrainian territory that Ukraine controls. The red, down in the south and the east, that's Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. The yellow is how far into Russia Ukraine was able to strike with its existing missile systems. That's about 77 kilometers deep. But inside this dotted line are 245 additional military targets that are within a 300-kilometer range. So these are airfields, they are unit bases, they're anti-air batteries, battalion positions. Now, this map was drafted this past summer, so things have changed. But it gives you a broad sense of what unleashing ATACMS missiles allows Ukraine to hit where it had no reach before.
Russian command is going to anticipate that Ukraine will fire these missiles. That means they will begin to be more careful on how they concentrate forces for an attack.
Ukraine's position is that it's been fighting with one arm tied behind its back, that self-defense doesn't just mean waiting for the enemy to come, but rather striking first to prevent incoming attacks. But there's good reason to question just how impactful this new capability will be.
It'll be significant, but not decisive.
Early indications from US officials tell us that this new long-range capability is intended to be used primarily in one region, one part of Russia, that might also explain a lot about why the US has suddenly changed its mind on all of this.
Russia is massing 50,000 troops. That includes North Korean soldiers for what looks to be a new offensive in Kursk.
Let me explain. You may recall a few months ago, Ukraine pulled off a daring ground assault, pushing several hundred square kilometers into Russian territory. Hundreds of troops, dozens of tanks, and armored vehicles. Well, it may surprise you to learn, Ukrainian forces are still there, reinforced, fanned out, and the Russians have been bombarding those positions. But very recent reports suggest they're now preparing for a major ground assault. 50,000 troops, both Russian and North Korean, to take back their territory. And US officials have said North Korea's involvement has very much changed the equation.
The addition of North Korean troops to buttress and support Russia makes it that much more difficult for Ukraine. So to try to kind of lessen that or mitigate that worsening situation, Biden has elected to send the capability to Ukraine.
So part of the stated goal here is to level the playing field. North Korea has already sent about 10,000 troops to Russia's aid, and there are reports it could send as many as 100,000, depending on how long the war goes. But the other thing to keep in mind, and this is what some experts we spoke to think may actually be the bigger thing, is that Ukraine is very much on the clock, because in 2 months' time, Donald Trump takes office.
Will he go for the threatened extreme policy of essentially conceding to Russia? That is one line of avenue. The other one is more that he will essentially insist that Ukraine seek a peace deal on the current terms with conceding sovereignty over the area Russia already has.
If Donald Trump attempts to end the war, as many experts have suggested, by conceding Ukrainian territory to Russia, Kursk suddenly becomes very important, because to date, it may very well be the only bargaining chip Ukraine has to win back its own territory in some kind of trade. So the goal, according to US officials, help Ukraine hold on in this Kursk region for as long as possible.
These systems will disrupt Russia's attempts to concentrate its forces as they attack Ukrainian positions in Kursk. Same with the logistics hubs.
Now, there are some important limitations where we don't really know how big of a deal they'll be. For starters, how many ATACMS missiles does Ukraine actually have?
It's insufficient numbers to significantly change the outcome of the battlefield. The Ukrainians will be able to complicate the planning and execution for the Russians. It will not be able to stop them.
Another thing we don't know, is this just one last big move by the Biden administration to turn the tide before leaving office? Or will this encourage other major contributors to Ukraine's defense, like the UK or France, to loosen long-range restrictions as well? They too will have to weigh the risks of inaction versus action, emboldening Russia by limiting help to Ukraine, or angering Russia by becoming more involved.
I think everybody realizes that there is no strategic victory for Ukraine at the end of this. So it's how much do you want to escalate against Russia? The Russians have said they will counter-escalate. So by saying yes to these missiles, there's a calculus that the Russians will hit back somehow.
Either way, the war has now escalated to a new level. Russia has already insisted this crosses a red line. This amounts to NATO being directly at war with Russia. And Ukraine has already made one thing very clear.
Але удари завдають не слова.
When it comes to the timing of any potential long-range strike, Adrian, Volodymyr Zelensky says such things are not announced. The missiles will speak for themselves.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, a tennis superstar closes out an illustrious career. Rafael Nadal bids farewell in our moment. The truly great athletes earn that distinction by chalking up victory after victory. Rafael Nadal spent 2 decades on the tennis court proving that, and today he showed us how dignity can triumph even when the athlete does not. So on the day of his Davis Cup quarterfinal singles match, the pride of Spain's self-proclaimed last hurrah is our moment. Nadal's most visible emotion of the day came during Spain's national anthem on home soil. Facing off against his Dutch opponent, every point scored brought cheers from devoted fans. They were there for him, no question, and no matter that final score, from the man himself, no apparent anguish, just a stoic moment of truth. Classic Nadal, really.
I lost my first match in the Davis Cup, and I lost my last one. So we closed the circle.
But don't get too humble. The 22-time Grand Slam champ burst onto the scene in 2004, just after Swiss star Roger Federer. We were both at the start of our journey, and it's one we ended up taking together, Federer posted today. 20 years later, Rafa, I have to say, What an incredible run you've had. Incredible indeed. Win or lose, it really is how you play the game. Very few have ever done it better. What a beautiful tennis player. Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic. In the last 20 years, if you watched good tennis on the men's side, you were watching these men. We will certainly miss it. From all of us at The National, thank you for being with us. You can watch anywhere, anytime on the free CBC News app and subscribe to The National's YouTube channel. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Take care.